Díomh agus fáilte arás, you're all very welcome to another episode of Irish in Toronto. Today I'll be speaking with Padraic Scanlan. Originally from Montreal, Padraic now lives in Toronto, where he is Associate Professor at the Centre for Diaspora and Transnational Studies and the Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto. In this episode, Padraic discusses growing up with an Irish name in Montreal, as well as his research on the Irish Famine. In 2025, he published his third book, Rot, An Imperial History of the Irish Famine. We discuss his research, his and his family's relationship with being Irish, among many other things. I would still encourage people to download the episodes and to share them with friends and family. Downloads are the easiest indicator for me to gauge how many people I'm reaching with these conversations, so I would really appreciate it. I began our chat by asking Padraic what it was like growing up with such an Irish name in Montreal.
Yeah, so I'm from Montreal. And it's funny, all of my dad's side of the family are Irish and came to Canada in the 1850s, right after the famine. Not during, but just after, from 52 to 56, I think. My brother did some genealogical research, and for whatever, they all had pretty anglicized names, right? So, like my dad was Lawrence, and there's Desmond and Margaret and Ellen, and then for whatever reason, either my dad, I guess, seized on it he was like, we're gonna just dial it up. And so, I got Padraic, right? And my brother Sean, which is much more legible, I think, in Quebec. And in the end, my parents pronounced it Padraic or Padraic.
Your parents pronounced it?
Yeah, just because it was just easier, I think, or because they weren't entirely sure. And consequently, I had this, it's only really when I moved to the UK that I started going systematically. I started introducing myself as Padraic just because it was just easier. And the point of reference was the golfer, right? I had Padraic Harrington. I was just like, I'm named after Padraic Harrington.
Even though his is Padraic.
Yeah, exactly.
So even that was...
Yeah, so even that was just but just to give people a point of reference. So it was only really for professional reasons when I moved to the UK that I had to kind of commit to a pronunciation that I would use. So growing up, it doesn't work in French at all, right? Yeah. Padraic, it doesn't work anyway. And my mom is French Canadian, and she wanted François Xavier, which would have been I could have been like a lawyer in Montreal. And actually I could have been prime minister, like Brian Mulroney, with like François Xavier Scanlan would have been pretty good. FX Scanlan. Anyway, so that was the other option, and I ended up with that middle initial. So my middle initial is Xavier.
That double-barrel first name in Quebec is quite normal, isn't it?
Yeah, to have like François, but it wouldn't have been hyphenated, right? It would have been just named after, So I'm not entirely sure what, I should have asked my parents what possessed them to choose those names. And I know that we had family friends who were annoyed that they didn't like really systematically pronounce it correctly. But it was just, it was an impractical name to begin with and doubly impractical in a francophone society. Yeah. So that's the main reason.
Interesting. And how I'm trying to do, I don't want to age you, but I'm trying to do the maths of when you would have been growing up in Quebec and what was happening at the time there. Would there be any benefit to having an Irish name or an Irish?
I don't know. I mean, maybe it's possible. That never occurred to me. I mean, my parents. So I was born in 1985, right? So that was right the year of the first independence referendum. And I guess I don't know, I feel like it's always a bit forced, right? Because practically speaking, most people with Irish heritage in Quebec who are Anglos voted against sovereignty anyway. But there is a kind of folding in the Quebec, more kind of militant wings of the Quebec independence movement to kind of fold by virtue of a shared Catholicism, the Irish immigrants to go back into that struggle, right? So they'll often have like the Patriot flag will be the symbol of the Patriot in the middle, but with the Irish tricolor in the background. But that's pretty niche. Like, I don't know whether my parents were playing on that at the time.
Yeah.
I know they supported the PQ, at least in the late 70s, right? And in the 1960s, like, it's hard to imagine, like my mom is from rural Quebec where basically the church ruled the whole province. And so coming to Montreal in the late 60s and then the Quiet Revolution, right, and the kind of ending of the power of the Catholic Church in Quebec was really closely associated with the PQ. It's possible, actually, that it is possible that they picked the name to kind of give me an edge in the new. They're like, well, everybody else will be purged, but this kid can stay.
Yeah. Create our own narrative around
Yeah,
it.
exactly. Yeah.
And what was it like growing up as a kid with an Irish name and a very Irish name in Quebec in the 80s and 90s?
I mean, I can't say it was anything in particular, right? Like, there were definitely a lot of. There were definitely a lot of like new Canadians with much more exotic, equally exotic names, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it didn't really register. I mean, I feel like it was always a difficult like roll call, but other than that, it was pretty easy. I had a baseball coach who called me Pedro and he was the coach of Pedro. I remember that vividly. So that was that kind of, and now it's funny. Now it kind of irritates me when people misspell it.
Yeah.
Well, it happens all the time. Like the A and the I are transposed.
Yeah.
But yeah. So other than that, I remember actually one like minor like house league hockey tournament where I had written it myself in my horrible handwriting, and it came out as Padraic because my R looked like a V.
Polish.
I wish I had kept that actually, Padraic, and but I don't think it was particularly noteworthy.
Yeah. And you mentioned very briefly at a recent book launch here for Ross. Growing up, there was times that even though you've gotten into it academically, there was times I don't remember, did you say it as a child, but
as an like a kind of cringe.
Yeah, cringe was the word you used. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't want to. I think my dad's generation was the closest to having. I would say that, I don't know. I'll have to ask my brother when I see him in Montreal in a couple of weeks. But I don't think that he or I felt any particular kind of sense of really distinct or focused Irish identity. But I do think that my dad's family definitely did. And in some ways, like my dad was the youngest of six. And 23 years, I think, separated him from his eldest sibling. So there were a bunch of them in a group, and then he was 9 years younger than his next eldest sibling, right? And his eldest sibling who's a Redemptorist priest, was, just like come from a completely different generation. Like my dad was a boomer, and my uncle Des was born in the 20s.
But he was basically your dad's uncle rather than
your
dad's brother.
Exactly. And had that kind of, and so I think for them and my dad's family, but for all the siblings except for him grew up in Point St. Charles, which is like at the time, very much an Irish ethnic enclave in Montreal. It isn't anymore.
There's a great little YouTube kind of mini documentary on Point St. Charles,
Yeah, the Point, and it's definitely, and Griffintown, right, which is like right across the train tracks. So those were not, I think my dad grew up in a different environment too. Like his family moved out of the Point between, so, I think my uncle was involved in a lot of kind of Irish fraternal organizations. So he was in the Hibernians, he was in the Knights of Columbus. And I think my father was a little bit more skeptical of that stuff and found it a little too churchy, I think, ultimately. And then I think, I feel like there was something in that difference between that kind of generational difference. And, I feel like living in the Point, one of the family lore anecdotes is that my Aunt Johanna married an Italian, my Uncle Tony. And famously, my grandfather said, "We've never let a foreigner cross our threshold before." You know what I mean? And so I feel like that world of, that sort of internal world, like St. Gabriel's Parish, right? That world was not at all the world that I grew up in. And so I always felt it felt a little bit like cringe-inducing, or like I was to kind of play on it. And I also found it, I guess, embarrassing to constantly have to explain the eccentric pronunciation of my name. You know what I mean?
I'm sure that
to not have to just, and to have really no connection to even they could have, my grandfather was Patrick, or was Michael, and his father was Patrick, you know what I mean? So they could have just They could have gone with Patrick, you know what I mean? But they opted for whatever reason to. I wish I knew, actually. That's something I wish I had. I wish I had asked of them. Yeah. So that was the main thing, and then and I guess out of a sense of in graduate school, I ended up writing about Britain, right? Which is not what I expected to be writing about.
Where did that interest come from, out of curiosity?
Honestly, it was just the strength of the teaching at McGill that ended up. I was interested in the 1790s in Britain, the kind of revolutionary moment during the French Revolution, and the ferment, the political ferment in, and so. I just kind of shied. I mean, it was the same reason why I didn't do Canadian history, which was foolish, because now in retrospect, there's, Canada's a very interesting place, but the way it was taught in high school, in Quebec in particular, definitely, I arrived in university without having those preconceptions about Canadian history disabused by anyone. And so, I just kind of avoided them. And I avoided them in graduate school until my parents died, I think is the main, and my brother went on a sort of voyage of self-discovery, and I wanted to compete with him, I guess, and write a book, you know what I mean? Take that, Sean.
Are you still competitive?
No, I don't think we're competitive. He's 11 years older than me,
okay.
Right? So he's got a very different, but he's not somebody who I don't think has much, I don't really know. It was unlike him to do, my Uncle Des, who was the priest, was a big time very interested in genealogical research, and consequently I was utterly uninterested in it. You know what I mean? By definition. But Sean doing some digging, I thought, well, maybe this is something I could write about. And I was also interested. It was a COVID book, right? Rot, or it started as a COVID book, thinking about contagion and disease and containment and all those kinds of themes, and I feel like it ended up being much more about a lot of familiar themes that I worked on before about political economy, but a lot more about Britain's relationship to Ireland and Ireland's relationship to Britain than it was originally conceived of.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is it a controversial thing to write about, the famine? Like, how does this, when you go to book launches and you talk about it with Irish people?
I mean, I think the biggest, in some ways my name is protection, you know what I mean? Like, if my name were, I'm just trying to think of the most British possible name, like Nigel Smith or something, you know what I mean? Or Giles. Actually, I have a friend named Giles Robertson, who is a very Englishman, so yeah, if it were Giles Robertson, it would be a very different story, you know what I mean? I think a lot of the questions have been, why didn't you call it the Great Hunger, right?
Interesting.
Which I was a kind of, and I think that, and that's been the biggest question, I think. But I'm not, I haven't really, so far I've experienced the way the book has been digested by historians of Ireland based in Ireland. And they're extremely combative. Generally,
that's what I meant.
Yeah. But I think it's been reasonably well received, and I think, yeah.
It's interesting. No, and I asked that question because you mentioned it at the book launch, but I wanted the listeners to kind of hear the because there's a narrative that we are, but to the average Irish person, not a historian, will study history until the age of 15.
Yeah.
As a compulsory subject, and then they may study it for leaving certificate and may study it for university, but most until they're 15. So the narrative of the famine is kind of, it's fossilized in your brain at the age of 15, and there's no further thinking about it, myself included. And I did study history a little bit more, but the way you presented may annoy people who left history at the age of 15 at a young age, because it doesn't go with what they want to believe. That's why I was asking about it being controversial.
What is the school there?
We want to blame the British for the entire thing, and we want to and look, to be fair to students studying history, I think at a young age, you have so many topics to cover. Like, sometimes it can, your memory of it will appear black and white, even if the teacher didn't intend for it to be like that.
Yeah,
it can come across that way. So, reading your book is one of the first times that I'm going through, a lot of the even a student mentioned to me recently, and she hasn't read your book yet, and I was telling her you need to read it, about the idea of Ireland, the market, I suppose, kind of being a little bit ignored and things like that. Look, a 15-year-old student isn't going to get that type of education, but even the idea of where the potatoes came from and the blight and that type of thing, as opposed to being, it's an easy narrative for us to believe that it was a black and white creation from was it John Mitchell wrote? What was John Mitchell's
sure. The next the final conquest of Ireland, perhaps, or whatever. I forget the title. Yeah.
God sent the blight, but Britain sent the famine. Something like that. Yeah.
I mean, that's not entirely wrong, right? I mean, I just think that's the. I mean, I think in some ways it's the same. It was a much more contentious kind of argument from my perspective as an historian writing about anti-slavery, right? Because I think my argument in my work on anti-slavery is that British anti-slavery was fundamentally much less revolutionary than it seems to be, and much more, and in some ways that's kind of an obvious argument because it wouldn't have succeeded if it hadn't been politically palatable, right? And I feel like that was, that Britain was to blame for the famine, but there was no specific person who was to blame, right? And so I feel like Charles Trevelyan is a very unpleasant figure and very hateable, and like in some ways, but it's like he could just as easily be implicated in the Bengal famines of the 1860s. Like he had a hand in both famines, right? And he is not a great, he's not an appealing character, but at the same time, he had no special power to affect what happened to Ireland. He was a lightning rod for, what was already in the air, right? And so what I try to do I think in that sense, like trying to explain history as structure is maybe easier with the famine than it was for anti-slavery, where, I'm just skeptical too of the claim that that the famine was genocidal.
And have people
a little bit. I've definitely got a couple of crank emails, sort of saying
from historians.
Oh no, from sort of readers or people who've heard about the book or heard it on especially I did I did a live radio, which I did disastrously at. Maybe it wasn't live, maybe it was taped. Anyway, it was a disastrous radio appearance on NPR when the book first came out in upstate New York, like the upstate New York NPR affiliate. And I think that's where the email came from, to be like, how dare you? Like, it is, and actually New York State passed a motion, it's the state legislature, declaring that the Irish famine was a genocide. And that it should be taught as such to school children. And I find that, that makes me a little bit uncomfortable, because there is a insofar as I have any kind of proximity to Irishness, I have learned that some of the things that I thought were sort of familial pathologies are in fact cultural pathologies, if you know what I mean. So there's a deep streak of self-pity, you know what I mean, and self-aggrandizement in the idea that like the famine was bad. Britain's relationship to Ireland was catastrophic. But the experience of the Irish in America was not the experience of Black Americans, and I feel like there is a strong undercurrent, certainly not among all Irish Americans, but in a certain tranche of Irish American public opinion that wants to see, a direct, either out of solidarity, which I think is a laudable, it's still an incorrect move to make, but if it's coming from a position of seeking solidarity, I think that's praiseworthy. But often as a kind of say we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. Why are you complaining? You know what I mean? We were NYPD cops and firemen, and now look, John F. Kennedy was the president, and Joe Biden, and we've got two presidents, and I feel like that is that's a different, where the famine sits in that narrative as a kind of founding moment of the diaspora is something that I'm kind of interested in now, although I don't think I don't think I'm going to write about it that much again. I'm working on something now where one of the sections on industrialization, where one of the sections is going to be on the Irish inner cities of British cities in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, which honestly would give people much more reason to hate Britain than, the experience of moving to New York, right? Like the position of an Irish immigrant in Manchester in 1840 was so wildly different and there was so much less opportunity for upward mobility and for escape from just like really brutal poverty than in North America.
Interesting. Yeah. That's good. No, I'm glad you at the book launch. I was very impressed with the way you explained it, and then to do it now, because there will be people who there'll be friends of mine who won't buy the book because they don't engage in buying that type of stuff, but they'd be annoyed at the narrative if someone told them what the book was about or without even reading it. So as much as I want to encourage people to read the book, I appreciate you giving that information as well, and just explaining it. And you were a true historian as well. Like, you don't want to. I appreciate that you're not trying to create villains and narratives, even if that may. I assume there are historians that create villains and heroes because it's sellable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely. I think there's I think the Great Hunger, the Cecil Woodham Smith history of the famine, is still the most readable single volume history of it, except for mine, of course. And her, for her, Trevelyan is the villain, and there is so much in his personal archive that is so incriminating. I made the mistake of reading a Reddit thread about, not even about the book, but about the novelist John Banville's review of the book in The Nation. And how dare Scanlan say that it wasn't colonial, like it was obviously colonial. And it's just, I think the problem is it's very hard when the history becomes entangled with nationalist politics to maintain the subtlety of an historian's approach to it, right? Because Ireland was absolutely in a colonial relationship to Britain. And I think that comes through really clearly in Rot, right? It was, the Irish were racialized in ways that were characteristically colonial. Ireland was exploited in ways that were characteristically colonial. But at the same time, Ireland's relationship to England also included a huge number of trained professionals, right? Like if you went to Australia in the 1860s, all the barristers were trained in Ireland, right? And they weren't just sort of Anglo-Irish, right? If you were, in a sense, like the colonial attitude towards Irish Catholics meant that Irish Catholics went to Australia if they were professionals or to the West Indies or to Canada, but they still had high-level qualifications and were the agents of empire. Right, so Ireland's relationship to Britain is colonial, but Ireland was never officially a colony in this, and so making that distinction, I think, annoyed. Especially if you're really committed to that. If one is really committed to that, it seems like that got under. Again, they didn't read the book, so it's kind of meaningless. It's just like whatever some guy said on the internet is neither here nor there.
Yeah. But it's hard not to read that stuff.
Sure. And you just like, I should look it up, and then you find it, and I'm like, now it's information I can't unknow, so I know that was the reaction.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, I think that's totally natural. I think you have to have thick skin to write anything and put words out there. So that's and the fact that you're working on something again means it didn't put you off you enjoy the writing process.
This one was. In some ways, like I think this book was my first. It was an experiment to see whether or not I could write a book while locked in my house. You know what I mean?
Not accessing archives.
Yeah, and so it's written with a lot of printed material. But I will say one thing for the British Empire in the mid-19th century, they published everything. Maybe even as a strategy of evasion, right? Just publish a 6,000-page document with every interview, so it was, I'm working now on a book about the kind of psychic, sounds so insane, the kind of like psychic consequences of industrialization is I think what the book has ended up being about. and it's kind of trying to, which I'm hoping is my kind of tech book, my AI book, sort of, just the experience of joining of the way that the introduction of industrialization and of industrial attitudes to time completely changed the working and living and cultural and social world of Britain in the 19th century. And one of the ways that industrialization changed the social world related to rot is by accelerating the already pretty considerable Irish emigration to Britain. And the transformation of the Irish immigrants from being seasonal economic migrants into being permanent residents in the UK, made possible by the Union, right? They were no longer subjects of, they were no longer part of, they were always subjects of the same crown, but now they were part of the same, they're equal citizens. And I think you can rehearse, like, the Irish immigrants in Britain were the objects of a lot of really intense speculation and theorization, and like the objects of statistical analysis and like social analysis, and they seem to be eroding, or maybe they weren't eroding, you know what I mean? So I think there's something about the way that industrialization de-skilled British workers and the way that Irish labor stepped into the breach that is not, like, I don't want to violate the historian's code and just write about the present, but this thing I'm working on now is feels much more presentist. And in some ways that's because of the generally pretty positive response to rot, that, and also working in a interdisciplinary department where there's a lot more kind of openness among my colleagues to, we'll write about the present a bit. So
yeah, good.
Yeah.
As we record, you're flying to Dublin tomorrow?
Next week.
Next
Wednesday, yeah.
So what's your relationship like with Ireland today, academically, outside of academics?
So I am going to, I'm doing a book event at a literary festival with Dermot Ferreter.
Have you met him before?
I haven't, no,
okay.
But I got a stack of his books on my bedside table from his publisher.
It's pretty heavy.
Yeah. I'm only bringing the paperback one. I don't have time to read them all. To talk about the famine, right, and the present. And so I feel like there is, I think there are, and, since the book has come out, I've built more relationships, I think, with Irish journalists and academics, especially on the left, for whom I think the arguments in Rot about the pressure on land for the Irish poor in the first half of the 19th century feels analogous to the housing crisis in contemporary Ireland, and for whom the position of Ireland as this ostensibly, literally rural, but ostensibly backward, pre-capitalist green, like pasture almost, in a pasture potato patch, and its relationship to finance in Britain is analogous to Ireland's relationship in the present to global capital markets, right? And I think that those moments of contact have been the most productive in terms of those kinds of conversations. And I'm not sure how this like book event will go, or whether that'll even come up, or whether it's just an opportunity for both of us to cynically try to sell some copies of our respective books.
Nothing wrong with that either.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know exactly how deep the those kinds of. But and I'm not the first person to do it. It's in Rot, right? There's a kind of like Banksy-ish Irish artist who's Spice Bag, right? Yeah. Who has put like the Guardian into a picture of like a famine eviction, right? And just, it's very on the nose, but I think that there is, which is an interesting kind of analogy, right? Because it's an analogy to the present that is maybe equally rickety to the analogies between the experience of the Irish in the 1840s was identical to the experience of, enslaved Africans making the Middle Passage, right? But it's the same kind of, it's a different, and I think that those forces, because those market forces that I try to describe in Rot are still, they're not gone, right? If anything, they're more intense than they were, and certainly absolutely more intense than they were in 1845. So
interesting. your own. I was at one of your book launches. It might have been one of the first book launches out in Queen East, Queen Books, and your son, I'm assuming,
Rafe,
was a very popular figure that night. Has he a relationship with Ireland? Do you have a relationship with Ireland with your family today, your existing family?
I mean, not really. I think like my wife is Welsh, and so I think he has a much more concrete relationship. And her parents, her dad is so she's, I guess, technically a second generation immigrant, right? Her dad came to Canada in 1984, and Catherine was born in 1985. And I've been to Wales many more times than I've been to Ireland. To visit her family and to see her nana, and so I think like he has much more of and we're always trying to get him to, and I think Alan, my father-in-law, is great because he's from Barrie, South Wales, and I think one of his regrets is that he didn't learn Welsh, and so we're trying to push Rafe to do choral singing, you know what I mean? And, so I think he has a much more of that kind of relationship. But I'd like to take the kids, just to kind of, I'm always, I don't really have, I don't know exactly our relationship, because we're so kind of, I'm skeptical of nationalism in general, right? And I don't want them to, but at the same time I would like to bring, and I do think it would be a nice place to, like, Rafe, you need to reconnect with any of this like super Anglo-Saxon name, Rafe Evans, right? He has my wife's surname, so he could have we were gonna name it. We entertained the possibility of inflicting on him. Talk about intergenerational trauma, or not to minimize intergenerational trauma, but we could have inflicted on him an insanely Welsh name, and we were definitely entertaining the idea of naming him an Iron. So we could have been, or an Iron, we could have named him an Iron Bevan Evans, to really just so we make sure he gets teased at school. Yeah.
Interesting.
But they're much more Welsh, I would say. Like, they definitely think more of themselves. And Rafe, when he's fantasizing about being a professional soccer player, he was like, I could play for Wales. I was like, well, you actually could, right? You have a British passport.
That's true.
You could play for Wales. You could choose. You could play for England. You could play for Wales. You could play for Canada. But you can't play for Ireland.
Interesting.
Because that's too distant in the past.
Interesting. Okay, good. We might leave it there if that's okay.
Oh, perfect. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Really hope you enjoyed that chat with Padraic. I would encourage anyone to purchase his book, Rot, An Imperial History of the Irish Famine, published by Basic Books. I want to thank him for agreeing to sit down with me and for being so honest during our chat. Once again, all feedback is welcome. You can email me. My email address is in the description of this podcast, or you can find me on social media. It's lovely getting messages from strangers and talking about the podcast and their stories of what brought them to Toronto. I would still encourage people to download the episodes and to share them with friends and family. Downloads are the easiest indicator for me to gauge how many people I'm reaching with these conversations, so I would really appreciate it. Thanks to Natalie Barbuzzi, who provided the logo for the podcast, and thanks to Shannon Heaton, who provided the music you are now listening to. You'll find all of her music on Spotify. There'll be another episode of Irish in Toronto in 2 weeks, and until then, slán go fóill.